Terrorism has changed. In the past, the predominant threat was highly organised groups with clear political intent, groups like Al-Qaeda. But now, alongside that, we also see acts of extreme violence perpetrated by loners, misfits.
The British government has launched an inquiry into the Southport attack where 3 little girls were murdered at a dance class in the small coastal town. On this episode of Newscast, we ask, are we living in a new era of terrorism? And also, it is day 2 of Donald Trump's presidency. He's been busy signing a series of executive orders. What do they tell us about his upcoming term? Do stay tuned to this episode of the BBC's daily news podcast, Newscast. Hello, it's James in the studio, and yesterday we brought you the news that Axel Rudakubana had pleaded guilty to murdering 3 little girls at a dance class in Southport on Merseyside last year. Now, last night, the Home Secretary, Yvette Cooper, announced a public inquiry into the attacks, and this morning, the Prime Minister has been speaking about the whole issue at a news conference in Downing Street. And let's just start by having a listen.
The tragedy of the Southport killings must be a line in the sand for Britain. We must make sure the names of those 3 young girls are not associated with the vile perpetrator, but instead with a fundamental change in how Britain protects its citizens and its children.
So, a lot to discuss. That was just a snippet of a pretty wide-ranging and interesting speech from the Prime Minister. And with me in the studio to discuss this is Daniel De Simone, investigations correspondent. Hi, Daniel.
Hi.
And Henry Zeffman, chief political correspondent, is at Westminster. Hello, Henry.
Hi.
Henry, before we get into the details, the precise details of the speech, I just wonder what you thought about how big a moment this was in Keir Starmer's time in Downing Street.
I think he made it a big moment. Look, it's not surprising that the Prime Minister, as any Prime Minister would, wanted to respond from Downing Street or with the authority of Downing Street to such an unimaginably brutal, horrific crime which shook so many people. And it's especially unsurprising given that this particular crime in the summer was the trigger for nationwide riots. But the Prime Minister's speech ended up being so broad and encompassed so many critiques and claims about British society way beyond this case that I think he kind of through force of personality made it what is undoubtedly one of the most significant moments of his 6 or so months as Prime Minister so far.
And very much up his street as a lawyer and a former prosecutor as well. Just give us a bit more of a flavour, Henry, as to the content, as to what he said.
Well, the Prime Minister started by stressing his response as a father, I think he said at one point, to what happened in Southport. It won't be surprising, again, I think, to people that he also wanted to spend a portion of the time hitting back against this idea that he could or indeed should have said more earlier about what many of us have just learnt in the last 24 hours or so, which is that Axel Rudakubana was known to various public authorities for some time before he carried out these murders. I think that was all basically what I was expecting, the Prime Minister responding to the charge that he was engaged in some sort of cover-up. But then he went much, much broader. He talked about how he didn't believe that the British state's approach to terrorism, and in particular the kind of legal architecture, has kept pace with the kinds of activities which are terrorist activities these days. He talked about loners, misfits, young men in their bedrooms, and questioned whether Prevent, for example, the counter-terrorism programme, was doing enough to catch those people in its ambit. But then he went bigger still, broader still. He talked about how to protect children on the internet. He talked about the rights and obligations that we all owe each other in society in a sense that they are fraying. He talked about how more and more people have fallen into living parallel lives, talking about absences of children from school post-COVID, failures of integration. It ended up being a pretty all-encompassing analysis, denunciation even, of the ways in which the state is, or as Keir Starmer I think would have it, isn't functioning.
And also to a certain extent as to what ails modern society as well. Henry, we'll come on to a lot of that, and I want to ask Daniel about some of those things in a minute, but can we just tidy something up? You mentioned the allegations that there had been a cover-up here. Can you just explain briefly, what was the Prime Minister's response to that? What is his contention as to why he says he could not have spoken in detail about this before now? Just to explain the legal framework and so on.
Of course. And first, let me just kind of briefly, I guess, sketch out the argument that there is of why there might be a cover-up. This is the claim made by some on the political right. Nigel Farage has definitely said it, and some senior Conservatives are saying it in a slightly different way, that Keir Starmer would have known very early on about the referral that Axel Rudakubana had to the counter-terrorism programme, and that he should have been upfront about that. Whereas initially, for some months, the police said that there was no terrorist, or they were not investigating this as having had a terrorist motivation. Keir Starmer said, look, it's very simple. If he had said pretty much anything beyond bland platitudes before the close of legal proceedings, which is the point we got to yesterday, essentially, when Axel Rudakubana pleaded guilty, then he would have run the risk of collapsing the trial. And one of the most passionate sections of Keir Starmer's speech was when he said nobody would have forgiven him, and rightly so, if by trying to make public statements with more detail, he had actually ended up enabling Axel Rudakubana to walk free from court as a free man, rather than what's going to happen now, which is that he'll get sentenced, presumably for a very, very, very long time, to prison on Thursday.
Daniel, at the heart of this speech was an argument that terrorism has changed, in Sir Keir Starmer's words, that Britain faces a new threat, not from groups with clear political intent like Al-Qaeda, he said, but from, as Henry says, loners and misfits obsessed with extreme violence, perhaps just for its own sake. I suppose the key question here, or a key question, is that true that this is a new threat?
It's not true that that's a new threat. This has been around for a while. I think if the Prime Minister's saying that this will always now be treated as terrorism, that would be new, because I think one of the issues here is that these sorts of acts and these sorts of people are not necessarily treated as terrorists by the authorities. And that's because there's a specific definition within the law, within the Terrorism Act 2000, about what terrorism is, which is effectively the use or threat of violence designed to influence the government, an international governmental organisation, or to intimidate the public or a section of it. And the use or threat of the violence is for the purpose of advancing a political, religious, racial or ideological cause. And so we see lots of people now, particularly younger people, who are interested in violence generally. They're accessing a lot of extreme material online, and that can come from different ideologies. It can come from Islamic State group, but it could also come from neo-Nazi groups, or it could relate to mass shootings or violence generally. And this group of people, so defined, make up effectively the largest group that are referred to Prevent, which is ultimately a counter-extremism, counter-terrorism programme. But then the number that are then referred on, which is around 7% of those people, are on to what are called channel panels, which actually then make a decision about what this kind of specific tailored programme for that person would be. That isn't the largest number that gets referred on to channel. The largest number are then extreme right-wing, then Islamist, then you get these conflicted groups. So I think the thing that the Prime Minister is getting at, he's saying this is a new threat. It isn't new. We have seen counter-terrorism police and MI5 looking at people who have effectively mixed or unstable ideologies for a long time. We've seen people prosecuted, including teenagers, who don't have a clear ideology. They can be prosecuted for terrorism offences, such as the terrorism offence that Rudakubana has pleaded guilty to, which was possessing a terrorist manual. We've seen people prosecuted for that before, despite the fact the prosecution don't say they have a particular ideology. It's also worth noting we've seen counter-terrorism police prosecute and get convictions for people who have been planning violence, even if they don't have a terrorist motive. For example, there were 2 teenagers prosecuted and convicted for conspiracy to murder in 2018 at a North Yorkshire school. That was a counter-terrorism policing investigation.
And when you're talking about these mixed ideologies, the government has been saying today, the Home Secretary Yvette Cooper has been saying in the Commons today, that there had been evidence that Rudakubana had expressed interest in school shootings, in the London Bridge attack, in the IRA, in MI5, generally in the Middle East. So that sort of speaks to that point. But there's a separate question as well as prosecuting something as a terrorist attack or a terrorist crime, and that is declaring a terror-related incident. There's been a lot of discussion in this case about why the police did not do so. The Prime Minister nodded to it today. And so is that a separate judgment for the police to make?
No, I think because they're working to the definition of terrorism, which is in the Terrorism Act 2000, which is the one I sort of read out. So that they would look and they would see, is there a clear motive, ideological motive, or is the actual act itself, can they define it as terrorism? What they're saying is they haven't been able to establish a clear motive. They're saying he's got a general interest in extremism and violence, and therefore they're not declaring it a terrorist incident. That's the judgment that they're making. Clearly, we've seen a number of attacks over the last few years in this country which have been declared terrorist incidents. So that they are, when we've seen attacks, including attacks with multiple victims, or even where we've seen individual attacks where one person has died, declared as terrorist incidents. So the authorities do make these declarations. They've made a decision not to in this case. I think MI5 spoke about it. The head of MI5 spoke about it in his update towards the end of last year. He said the headline numbers for them are that 75% of their investigations rate to Islamist extremism and that 25% rate to extreme right-wing terrorism. But within that, there are people who have a very tenuous grasp of the ideologies that they're coming into contact with. They might be accessing material from different ideologies, and therefore it's really unclear exactly what is motivating them. But it doesn't mean they're not a threat, and I think that's what the Prime Minister appears to be getting at, that there's a group of people who are clearly a threat to the public, that pose a threat to public safety, but are they perhaps falling between stools because they're not being seen as falling within a particular ideological group?
You mentioned Prevent. Henry, the Prevent scheme, the government says Rudakubana was referred to it 3 times before the attacks, between 3 and 4 years before Southport. And the Home Secretary has been telling the Commons that there's been something called a learning review into Prevent that's going to be published after sentencing on Thursday. Sorry, it's all quite complicated, this, isn't it? Because there's the public inquiry. But this is separate, Henry, is that right? What is a learning review and what is Prevent, for that matter?
Well, Prevent is the government's counter-terrorism scheme which, as Daniel was describing, individuals can be referred and then from then on the authorities make a decision about what to do with them. I mean, I'm not particularly an expert on that. What I do know is that basically everyone in Westminster for some time has had the view that Prevent is failing, but where they disagree is the way in which it's failing. So some people think it has focused too much on far-right extremism. Some people think it has focused not enough on far-right extremism. Some people think it has focused too much on Islamist extremism. Some people think it's focused not enough. And then some people just think, well, it's not catching the right people. I mean, that's a very simple caricature of what are more complex arguments. But it's not novel for a governing party to decide that Prevent is not operating in the way in which they would like to, I guess is the point I'm making. The other sort of review or reviewing position that Keir Starmer mentioned in his speech, and Yvette Cooper's just talked about in the House of Commons again, is a new independent reviewer of Prevent. So this is going to be a man called Lord Anderson KC, David Anderson. He was the government's independent reviewer of terrorism legislation for some years. He's a member of the House of Lords and quite an active commentator on the ways in which various bits of the kind of security state, if that's the right phrase, are and aren't working. He is going to look at Prevent for the government. So that is going to run separate to the public inquiry, but I think could end up being one of the most significant things that comes out of today, depending on what Lord Anderson, David Anderson, ends up saying.
I think what there's an issue about, and the Home Secretary is saying this today in the Commons, she's sort of saying that he was referred 3 times to Prevent On each occasion, counter-terrorism police made an assessment that he didn't need to be referred on to a channel panel. And she's been critical of that and saying that the learning review that took place has said that was the wrong call, that there wasn't kind of a link made between the different referrals. Clearly, if someone's being referred for real interest in violence 3 times, you might think that would be a red flag in itself, because obviously even if someone doesn't want to engage with Prevent, and Prevent itself can't do anything, that doesn't stop intelligence being shared with the police, with MI5, and clearly intelligence that comes from Prevent does go to police and MI5, and they can make a decision then about whether there's anything they need to do. And we do see people who are prosecuted for terrorism offences, even though they don't have a clear ideology. And that's what's often referred to within this world as a disruption. So, for example, Rudakubana actually has been prosecuted for having an Al-Qaeda manual. That could have happened earlier if he'd been found with that, for example. You wouldn't have needed to show that he had a particular ideology. You could have just said, the fact that this person has it, we're going to prosecute that. And that would have been a disruption that could have disrupted his ability to operate.
Henry, final thing, and that is, let's not forget the riots that followed this, and it's a crucial part of why we're here discussing it. There's discussion about tech companies here in 2 regards, I suppose. Removing dangerous material, such as that which Rudakubana had apparently viewed online that we heard from the Prime Minister, and also just the allegation that there's a fanning of the flames after the Southport killings that social media companies to a certain degree should take responsibility for. And this, to a certain extent, does it not, pits the government against the billionaire owner of X, Elon Musk?
Well, let's take them in turn. So, yes, there is absolutely the element of material online and not just material online, but also purchases online. Leading the BBC website and app as we speak right now is Yvette Cooper, the Home Secretary, saying it was a total disgrace that Axel Rudakubana could buy a knife on Amazon, which obviously does many more things than, it's a multifaceted tech company which works with government in many ways. But clearly that is an interesting posture for the government to strike. In terms of the material they have, because obviously that's where Axel Rudakubana access this material. That is something that governments of various stripes have been talking about for some time. This issue of how to police the internet, to what extent are these social media companies publishers or otherwise? How can you punish them potentially if they are continually hosting harmful material? The Online Safety Act, which was debated for years, was designed in part to address some of these issues, but clearly there is not total satisfaction in government that it has done so. And then the broader piece, as you say, about misinformation and the riots in the summer. And we should just say, by the way, that, some of the, at least for some elements, the riots that were sparked by this case back in the summer were sparked by claims like, Axel Rudakubana had come here on a small boat. Things that just definitively we now know, to an extent we always did, but now know just nonsense. That issue with what social media platforms publish, again, just comes straight back to the legal architecture, whether they're publishers and so on. And, that man who we've spent so much of 2025 talking about, who yesterday was on a podium with the new president of the United States, Elon Musk. The government has, complex dealings with him, shall we say, to start off with, and they're only going to get more complex.
They are. Henry, thanks very much. Well, as Henry just mentioned, President Trump is back, obviously, and late last night, UK time, he issued a flurry of what are called executive orders. We'll explain exactly what they are in a moment, but many of them basically reverse some of Joe Biden's policies. And Mr. Trump has also issued nearly 1,600 pardons in connection with the Capitol riots on the 6th of January, and we're actually expecting, I believe, many prisoners to be released within the next few hours. So the presidency might not yet be 24 hours old, but there's a lot to discuss. And Caitriona Perry, chief presenter for BBC News and friend of the pod, is, I'm delighted to say, here to discuss it with us. Hello, Caitriona.
Hi, I'm delighted to be here as well. I am on yet another cold rooftop here in Washington, D.C. It's about -11 or -12 degrees Celsius, but the sun is on my back and it's warming up. I think I'll be maybe able to take off one layer of hat and one layer of gloves in the next hour.
We'll look forward to that happening. A glove coming off. We'll know you're doing well. I mean, I think it's all relative. It's warming up at -11. Anyway, executive orders, Caitriona, can you tell us what they are? Just give us a bit more detail, first of all.
Sure, well, we've heard so much chat, haven't we, about executive orders and executive actions, and they aren't different. When people talk about executive actions, that's kind of a catch-all term for things that a president might do. Some have very great effect and some have not very much effect at all. But when we talk about executive orders, they're the ones with the real power punch. They're the ones that a president has power. It doesn't require legislation agreed through Congress by the representatives of the House and the senators, but that a president himself can actually sign that document, as we've seen Donald Trump doing with his big Sharpie and holding it up, and that those things take effect pretty quickly. Some of them, however, can be challenged through the courts. So still a bit of a quagmire when you look at everything that Donald Trump did yesterday as to what comes into effect immediately and what will be a bit longer term.
There was typical Trump theatrics, wasn't there, with those Sharpie marker pens that he loves, throwing the pens into the crowd as he signed them and so on. Can you, what are the ones that are most important? I mean, he signed so much, Caitriona, we can't go through all of them, obviously, but for newscasters, what would you pick out?
He signed 26 of them, which by my count is a record on the first day of a presidency. Joe Biden did 9, and often, most of the time, presidents don't sign these things at all on the first day. They might the first few days. But the first thing that Donald Trump signed was one that undid 76 executive orders that Joe Biden had signed. So everything he said about wanting to row back what Joe Biden and the Democrats had been doing, he did just that with his first action. Some of the others referred to the federal government. We know, of course, Elon Musk is working with him to try and reduce the size of the federal government, the number of federal workers, how many people are employed. One that will affect a lot of people is he's ended the working from home option for federal workers. They'll all have to come back into the office. He withdrew the US from the Paris Climate Accord. Of course, he did that in his first term. He set a plan to withdraw from the World Health Organization over the next 12 months. He did that as well. He issued a pardon for the 1,600 or so individuals who were arrested, charged or convicted in relation to the riots on Capitol Hill in 2021. Also a few other things about freedom of speech and how the federal government and the military would approach certain things, and of course an awful lot of them about immigration and policies. Primary, of course, was declaring this national emergency along the border, which frees up a lot of funding to be directed towards the border and allows the US military to be deployed along the US-Mexico border as well.
I mean, there's enough there to fill news bulletins for about a year. But before we get into the really serious stuff, there is some colour emerging from the Oval Office as well, isn't there? He reinstated the bust of Winston Churchill, the British wartime Prime Minister, and a Diet Coke button is back. What's a Diet Coke button?
A Diet Coke button is basically slang for a button that you can press on your desk and say, "Can I have a Diet Coke?" and one of your assistants brings it into you. So I guess if you're President of the United States, these are the things that you can have installed on your desk. And actually it was really interesting to note yesterday at the inauguration and the big fancy lunch that was held, a congressional celebratory lunch on Capitol Hill, you could see the waiters starting to pour red and white wine and so on, as is the way of at these events. And then they brought out a can of Diet Coke for President Trump, all wrapped up nicely in a white linen napkin, and presented that to him, because we know this is his drink of choice. Coca-Cola even presenting him with a special commemorative bottle to mark his election as well. So yeah, he's a fan.
Yeah, he doesn't drink alcohol, of course. That's one of the things about Trump that we know. Anyway, to the substance, and let's be honest, the abnormal substance, Caitriona, because we have here a man who extraordinarily refused to accept the result of a democratic election 4 years ago, is seen by many as inciting his supporters then to go to try to challenge that result with a violent attack on the American seat of government on Capitol Hill. The legal process follows. Many of those people are convicted through due process in the courts and now will be freed at his behest. This is not normal, is it?
This is something that has spurred a lot of debate in the last, how many hours is it? 15 hours or something since he signed that order, because, of course, President Trump had signalled this way in advance that he was going to pardon these individuals who'd been charged or convicted in relation to the events of January 6th. But what we didn't know was whether he would pardon some, most, or all of them. And he'd been using those words kind of interchangeably over the last couple of months. We'd heard Vice President J.D. Vance and many other members of Congress saying they didn't feel it was appropriate for all of them to be pardoned, but some of them who were facing charges to do with basically being there on the day that they felt they were expressing their First Amendment rights to free speech, and that these charges were, trumped up and weren't real and valid charges. But the range and the spectrum of individuals is quite large. So the fact that we know now that President Trump has decided to pardon all of those involved, that is spurring a bit of debate. It's quite early here in Washington as we're chatting now, following on from a long day and a late night yesterday. But I do think as the city wakes up that we will start to see more and more reaction from members, even of his own party, who aren't fully in favour with such a blanket pardon like this.
No, because some of these people were convicted, for example, of assaulting police officers. And the Republican Party has, and traditionally, liked to portray itself as a party, a defender of law enforcement, a defender of the rule of law. So I wonder to what extent there will be, even among, and you've hinted at it there, Caitriona, even among his own side, some disquiet here.
Yeah, and there are a number of Republican members of Congress who are on the record as saying that these crimes were committed on federal property. So that takes them to an elevated level. And, members of Congress were basically running for their lives at one point from what was an angry mob. They were in a lockdown situation. Many of them spoke at the time of hiding under their desks, of being fearful. Many had family members with them on that day because, of course, January 6th is this day of great ceremony when usually the results of an election are certified and all the new members are there. So it's usually a very joyful occasion. So one of the individuals, just to pick out one who was released from jail already, Enrique Tarrio, he's the former national leader of the far-right Proud Boys. He was actually sentenced to 22 years in prison for a seditious conspiracy charge related to the attack. So a 22-year prison sentence is a big one. That's obviously a big crime, a big serious charge that he was facing. There were others who had been sentenced to 18 years or so. There was another individual, Guy Reffitt, who'd carried a firearm during a standoff with police, and that helped facilitate the mob's approach on the Capitol. So there will be a lot of debate as to, whether this was an appropriate thing or otherwise to do. But the fact of the matter, and I've been speaking to a congressman about this just this morning actually, Mark Alford from Missouri, and he said, who's a Republican, and he said, look, this is I'm not necessarily in full agreement with this, but I'm not the President of the United States. I believe in President Trump. I think he has our best interests at heart, and it's his decision. Therefore, it's a done deal.
There's a lot to discuss about how we got to this moment in terms of the social media campaign, Elon Musk, the billionaire owner of X, richest man in the world, and his influence on the administration, and also what he's been up to, Caitriona. But before that, I feel like we've almost breezed past, because there's so much to talk about, two enormous things. And I wonder if we could just go into a little bit more detail on them. The withdrawal from the World Health Organization and the Paris Climate Agreement. On any other day, these both individually would be enormously consequential decisions by any government, but particularly by the US government.
Absolutely. If we take the World Health Organization, first of all, for starters, the US is the biggest contributor of funding to the World Health Organization. So one of these executive orders that President Trump has signed says that the US will pull out of it over the next 12 months. So that is a massive chunk of the World Health Organization's budget that's going to be removed. Now, we did see President Trump try to do this the last time he was in the administration, and it all spans and all leads back to the WHO's handling of the COVID crisis, the pandemic, which many in the world around President Trump just don't agree with. All of the issues regarding vaccine mandates and so on. You know, we saw him say yesterday that he also was going to reverse a US military policy, which was that anyone who refused the COVID vaccine at the time would be removed from office. He said he was going to reverse that, restore all of those individuals and pay them their salaries that they've missed out on in the meantime. So a very serious issue, and one that's very close to President Trump and those around him, obviously Robert F. Kennedy Jr. as well. So that's the World Health Organization. If we look then at the Paris Climate Agreement, again, that's something that Donald Trump did as well in his first administration. And then when Joe Biden came back into office, he returned the US and re-signed back up to that agreement. And again, it's an important one because of the size of the United States, isn't it? I mean, we talk about net contributors and those who are doing their best to try and reduce the scale at which the global warming is taking place and contributing towards reducing carbon emissions and so on. And that just, for Donald Trump and for what he wants to do with this country, that just doesn't align for him. He talks often about using more of the natural resources in this country. It's very oil and gas rich. We even heard him in his inaugural address yesterday saying, "Drill, baby, drill." That famous phrase of his that he uses in almost every rally and speech that he gives. And there is a lot of support for that. There is a lot of support for moving towards a situation where the United States is energy independent. But again, speaking to some Congress people, even members of the Democratic Party who are perhaps in favour of loosening up some of those regulations, they say that they don't have to be mutually exclusive, that you can still protect the environment and be part of big international deals like this, and also better utilise the natural resources in this country.
Now, I know you've got to go in a second, Caitriona, but first, you mentioned Elon Musk, and I'm sure many newscasters will be aware that there is a gesture that he made that's been getting a lot of attention. It's on lots of people's social media feeds online. How are we describing this gesture?
A gesture, basically, is how we're describing it. And just to describe it for anyone who hasn't seen it, although, as you say, it's all over all social media platforms this morning, is basically Elon Musk was making a speech at that Capital One Arena last night where the presidential parade was held, and Donald Trump spoke and signed many of these executive orders. And he basically put his hand on his heart and then gestured out into the crowd. And there's been speculation, was he trying to do a dab, or was he trying to kind of throw his heart out to the crowd? But he did it with his arm very straight. I'm obviously not going to do it here now, and kind of straight up into the air. It's sort of a 45-degree angle, which there has been some interpretation of. Was this a Nazi salute? Of course, Elon Musk says it absolutely was not that he was kind of saying, "Oh, I take you to my heart, you're in my heart," this kind of thing to all the supporters who had gathered there in the auditorium, because these were the really, really hardcore supporters who had presented themselves outside that sporting arena in the wee hours, in the pitch dark, in -6-7 degrees Celsius, to try and get in and wait all day to see Elon Musk and Donald Trump and the Trump family and the cabinet members and so on. So, I mean, it's controversial, a lot of discussion about it. I sort of feel the space that we're in at the moment, anything Elon Musk and Donald Trump does spurs controversy, doesn't it? I mean, this country is so polarised. 77 million people voted for Donald Trump, 75 million people didn't. So that is the face of America, and that is what we're moving into, as Donald Trump says he's trying to bring America into a new golden age.
Yeah, we'll see. We will see. Thank you very much, Caitriona, for joining us, as always, on Newscast.